Hey everybody, welcome to St Stephen's Online. We hope you enjoy catching up on our talk from Sunday.
So today we're going to begin, as Thomas has told us, our new sermon series, looking at the life of Moses in the book of Exodus. And as with so many Old Testament characters and stories, we're going to discover through this series that nothing, nobody, no earthly power or spiritual power is beyond the power and authority of God. We're going to discover that God is the one who weaves himself into the micro of one person's life, into the micro of one family, but also into the macro of a whole people, a whole nation, and the whole story of the human race. And ultimately, we're going to discover the grace of God again, his undeserved favor and love, showered upon an unworthy person and people, pointing us again to his incredible and amazing grace. And so we're going to dive straight into the Bible. It will help you to have a Bible in front of you. I'm going to put some of the verses on the screen as well. So feel free to run and grab a Bible or get it open on your phone if that will help. Because I'm also going to be referring to chapter 1 as well as Exodus 2. I thought it was a little bit too much to read 1.5 chapters. But I'm going to be looking at chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2 as we begin this journey together. So the writer of Exodus takes up where Genesis finishes. After ending up in Egypt to escape famine in the land of Canaan, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph have filled the land of Egypt. But over the years, power and relationship has shifted in that land. The Pharaoh that appointed Joseph has died, and with him, the relational capital between the rulers of Egypt and the people of Israel seems to have died too. And ultimately, the new king, the new Pharaoh in Egypt, is feeling threatened by the number of Israelites that have filled the land. And so what we see in chapter 1 is the Pharaoh trying 3 tactics to oppress the Israelite people. Tactic 1 we see in verse 11 of chapter 1. The Pharaoh puts slave masters over the Israelite people, i.e. he uses them as forced labor to build the store cities of Pithom and Ramesses. But we discover that despite the conditions, despite the oppressive conditions he puts the Israelites under, they continue to multiply. And so he goes to tactic 2. Tactic 2 comes into play, and we find that in verse 15. The 2 Egyptian midwives, whose job it is to help the Hebrew women in childbirth, are commanded to kill all Hebrew baby boys at birth. Now, what I find interesting here is Pharaoh's command to kill the baby boys, when across history, most infanticide is against girls. But by killing the boys, what he's doing is preventing the growth of the nation. But by keeping the girls, he's guaranteeing a ready supply of more women who could then easily just be assimilated into the Egyptian population as concubines or slaves or wives to Egyptian men. But tactic 2 doesn't work either. Why? Because we're told in verse 17 that the Egyptian midwives feared God. And so in a blatant act of civil disobedience, these 2 women disobey the instructions of Pharaoh. It's a pretty gutsy move, isn't it? And ultimately, it appears that they know that they've been asked to do something by those in authority, which God forbids. And so by letting the babies live, they act in obedience to God, but in disobedience to the human power. And God responds in kindness and blessing to these 2 Egyptian midwives. A while ago, I heard, I think it was on a podcast actually, Tim Keller, he died 2 or 3 years ago now, he was a preacher and church leader in the US, speak about the biblical basis for civil disobedience, and he talks about this particular incident. And he explains that even though the Bible does on a number of occasions make it clear that as Christians we should submit ourselves to civil authority, we find examples in Romans 13, in 1 Peter 2, if a human government commands something, though, that God forbids, as is happening here with this command to the midwives to kill the Hebrew babies, then it's our Christian duty to challenge or even disobey it. God trumps everything. One of the most notable historic examples of this is the case of theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Lots of you will have heard of him, and it happened during the Nazi era in Germany. And he warned early on of the dangers posed by this new regime and the cult of the Führer, and was appalled both at the ideology's incompatibility with the biblical idea of what it means to be human. He was appalled at the Nazi persecution of the Jews, but also was appalled at the way that the German church was aligning itself with the Nazi state. And so led a whole movement which was called the Confessing Church that opposed the Nazi regime and spoke out with incredible courage. And in 1943, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was arrested and finally executed 2 years later without any trial. In our present day, there's a challenge to us still, as we read Exodus 1 and the rest of Scripture, to consider where we might have the opportunity to speak biblical truth to power, to challenge misguided policy or authority, or to support Christian organizations who do this through their Christian advocacy work. But despite the disobedience of these midwives, Pharaoh doesn't give up. He's determined, so decrees tactic 3, verse 22 of chapter 1. He gave this order to all his people: every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, and let every girl live. We discover here Pharaoh's tactics paralleled in the New Testament, don't we? If you look forward and think about the birth of Jesus, Herod there in Matthew 2, out of fear that he's losing control of his power base, that he is about to be undermined by this king of the Jews, attempts to destroy a whole generation of babies in Bethlehem. But in both of these incidents, we discover that nothing and no one is beyond the power and control of God. In both of these moments, a guy called Alan Cole, who's a theologian, says this: God's chosen agent is protected in both these incidents. Neither Pharaoh nor Herod can stand in the way of God's plan. So by the time we reach the end of chapter 1, the context of hostility towards and oppression of the Israelite people is set in. But God is over all and will work his purposes out, even in the midst of oppressive regimes like this. Today, there are still millions of Christians, and we were praying about this a few moments ago, who live in countries and contexts where they face hostility and are persecuted for their faith on a daily basis by individuals, extremist groups, or by governments who design their policy to control and oppress the other, the church. But time and again during the past 2,000 years of Christian history, when people try and oppress God and his people, what happens? God works his purposes out, and often growth happens. In Iran, as an example of this, at the moment in Iran, Christians have hugely limited rights. Daily life and worship for them is massively restricted. And Christians, and particularly Christian converts from Islam, face surveillance, arrest, violence, persecution by the government. And yet, Yet in the context of this extreme oppression and struggle, what is happening? The church in Iran is growing exponentially. Last year, the number of Christians in Iran grew a massive 19.6%. So we're experiencing church growth in the UK at the moment. Just to compare, our church growth is 1.2% last year, 19.6%, with the majority of those being younger people moving away from Islam to Christianity. And it's said that 19.6% is actually a conservative estimate and may not fully reflect the actual situation. What about in the UK? Into the sometimes oppressive context of liberal secularism and atheism in our society, God is at work. People are encountering Jesus in miraculous ways and are coming to faith in Jesus all over the place. Every week, myself and Thomas and Lauren and others as well meet people who are turning up here at St. Stephen's because they are spiritually searching. And perhaps they've gone past on the bus. We hear this numerous times. People have been searching for something and have gone past on the bus and seen this church and said, I need to go to that church. They felt drawn in here. We know it's the power of the Holy Spirit. God is on the move and will work his purposes out despite governments and regimes. He'll work his purposes out in the lives of individuals and the church and the nation. Anyway, we could go on about this for ages. Let's get into chapter 2. And this chapter is the one where God works his purposes out despite everything. It's into this context then of oppression of the people of God that the story of Moses really begins. And how does he work his purposes out? He does so supernaturally. So let's look at the tactics that God uses to work his purposes out. Tactic 1, he uses a basket. Thomas found that in a charity shop. I'm sure it was something like that, the basket. An Israelite man and a woman, they give birth to a son. The boy's mum manages to hide him for about 3 months, and then it becomes a bit too difficult. Why? Because he's probably loud. And what we see next is the desperate move of a mother trying to save the life of her fine baby boy. She takes a papyrus basket, she waterproofs it with tar and pitch, and she places the basket with the baby in amongst the reeds at the banks of the River Nile. Every step of what happens here is a deliberate attempt to save the child's life. The basket, the waterproofing, even the place that she chooses on the banks of the Nile. Amongst those reeds, that will have provided protection from the sun, perhaps safety from people looking for the children that will have been thrown into the Nile. Perhaps as well, safety from the current. She didn't want the basket to be taken by the current down the Nile, because maybe she chose that place too because she knew it was the place that one of Pharaoh's daughters came to bathe in. And the baby's sister, we later learn she's called Miriam. She stands at a distance, probably instructed by her mum, do not leave that spot. Watch, see what happens. And then it just so happens that Pharaoh's daughter appears. Tactic 2, family. Now, we know from ancient records that pharaohs generally had multiple wives and concubines, and it's believed that this particular pharaoh had around 60 daughters. In my mind, I've always thought, couple of daughters, couple of sons. He had about 60 daughters, a little excessive. But this is the daughter that God chooses to use to work his purposes out. She encounters this baby boy in the basket. And verse 6, look there, she declares there's something about the softness of her heart here. This is one of the Hebrew babies. She's aware of her father's command to kill the baby boys. But in contrast to her father's genocidal actions, her response is different. She responds in real humanity. Her heart goes out to this abandoned baby. And then, in an act of courage and boldness, Miriam, Moses' sister, just so happens to step out of her hiding place and offers to find a random, not Hebrew woman to nurse the child for Pharaoh's daughter. So not only does Pharaoh's daughter then agree to this cunning plan, but then offers to pay the Hebrew woman as well. In this one encounter, the most dire of circumstances for this baby and the baby's family is completely transformed. The baby's life is saved. He's reunited with his mother and family. And now his mother, remember, the family are in slavery. So what does that mean? It means they do not get paid for their work. She's been paid to feed her own child. This could have saved the lives of the whole of that family as well. But that isn't the end, because God's tactic here is to use the family. Moses then spends, and scholars believe it be between 5 and 8 years of his most formative years with his birth family, being loved, being nurtured, being taught, being formed. His racial and spiritual identity will have been embedded within him. Essentials that we'll see over the coming weeks are fundamental to the leader that he's going to become. I just want to take a moment to speak to any of us here who have influence or input into the lives of children. Do not underestimate the importance that your Christian parenting or grandparenting or godparenting or auntie and uncling or friending has on the lives of the children you influence or teach or parent in some way. I think it's so easy for us to hand over all our spiritual influence to church, to school, to kids ministry, to youth, because they're the pros. But as important as all that is, and we really believe it is important, as important as all that is, the impact that you can have as a Christian parent or grandparent or friend or godparent or whatever will nearly always have the biggest impact and influence on those children in terms of their future values, the morals that they choose to live by, their decision to have a personal faith in Jesus. So carefully and prayerfully consider the messaging you give the children in your lives about, for example, the importance of church and Christian community and the priorities that we give it. Keep praying for the children in your lives, whatever age they are. Keep speaking of Jesus and telling the stories of what God is doing in your life. Just sharing scripture. This does not have to be forced, but just naturally in the stories that we tell whilst we're eating together or in the car. Ultimately, what we're doing is enabling those children to discover that their most important identity is not their gender or their sexuality or their future work or found in their academic or sporting prowess, but ultimately is found in Jesus Christ. And this is not like a success or a failure thing as well. We can sometimes think, oh, my child or godchild or grandchild isn't a follower of Jesus. Ultimately, these children grow up and make their own choices, don't they? But actually, God is far bigger than our influence, but our influence is still really important. We can love them, we can pray for them, we can speak well of God to them. And so it's clear here that for Moses, the foundations of who he will become in the following chapters are laid down in this significant time with his family and his place within the Hebrew community. But that's not the end of it, because God has tactic 3, family #2. Because that is because what is written in verse 10 is really crucial here. The verse is on the screen. When the child grew older, she took him I think that's Miriam, to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. Pharaoh's daughter adopts Moses, and he becomes part of Pharaoh's larger household. And he would have received a world-class education. He'd have been taught practical skills. He'd have been trained as a leader. So by the time he's an adult, Moses has had the input of his birth family and community, fundamental to the formation of his spiritual and cultural identity. And yet through his adopted family, he's had this incredible secular education, learning under the greatest leaders of the day. And it's this unique and beautiful combination which makes him the man and the leader that he will become, the one that God chooses to lead his people out of slavery. And centuries later, God once again worked out his purposes through the intricate story of a family. Another baby is born, but this time under supernatural circumstances. And once again, God is present in every detail of that baby's birth and early life. Over the coming weeks, we'll watch as God raises up Moses to become the rescuer of the Israelites, leading them out of slavery. And again, we'll be drawn back to that other baby boy who grows up to be a man, Jesus, God in human form, the one who is the ultimate rescuer. But this time, he won't just rescue the Israelite people, but rescue the entire human race. Through his life and death and resurrection, Jesus opens the way for each of us to be set free from the slavery of sin. But these first two chapters of Exodus remind us crucially that God can and does work his purposes out, even through the most dire of circumstances. God steps in to the context of the brokenness of humanity, of failure, of pain, of hardship, of oppression, and he weaves his plan, his bigger story, his purposes out. And so many of us here, I know, have stories of how God has done this in our own lives. How he's taken the broken or the painful or the messed up or the joyous and woven his story into ours. I've been the vicar here for 18 months now. Some of you are thinking it's felt like longer than that. And the story of how I ended up here is the story of God weaving his story into mine, working his purposes out over many, many years. It wasn't always an easy journey, and it began many years ago. I guess I'm here because of a conversation that I had with a bishop in a pub, as you do, in East London 3 years ago, who encouraged me to step more fully into my calling as a leader. And I'm here because of the friends who spoke into my life, encouraging me to listen to God and to really trust in him. I'm here because I happen to be married to John, who is the most incredibly supportive and enabling husband. I'm here because of all the various people who took a risk on me. I'm here because of some of the earliest women clergy, because I've been around quite a long time, who demonstrated obedience and encouraged me. I'm here because when I strayed, God never let me go. I'm here because when I was 22, God spoke to me clearly about being ordained. And even though I was horrified and thought it was completely ridiculous, a few people affirmed that calling, significant people in my life. I'm here because even when my life was falling apart, my family life, when I was 19, I knew that God was my solid rock and my foundation. I'm here because when my dad left when I was 15, I discovered that God was faithful and he brought healing and hope. And I'm here because of all the people in my early years who taught me and showed me the love of Jesus. I'm here because when I was 6, I decided that Jesus saved, and I asked Jesus to be Lord of my life. I'm here because since then I've walked through the valleys and the mountaintops of life, and I've known the power of God to be real. I'm here because my mum and dad prayed for me since before I was born. I'm here because my mum went to some stadium in Liverpool, I believe, and gave her life to Jesus, a Billy Graham crusade in the 60s. She was the first committed Christian in the whole of our family history. So yes, I am a spiritual grandchild of Billy Graham. There's so much more that I could share about how and why I've known God weaving his purposes in and through my life, through the good and the difficult times. And we could all share those stories now, couldn't we? Paul writes in Romans 8:28, the verses on the screen there, that through the joys and through the sorrows, through the challenges and encouragements, we can know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. So just a couple of things to leave us with today. Firstly, recognize the power of ordinary faithfulness. Recognize the power of ordinary faithfulness. Moses' rescue here in chapter 2 wasn't flashy. It happened through everyday faithfulness of a mother, of a sister, a family, a daughter of Pharaoh, a community. Never underestimate the influence of your daily choices, especially in influencing perhaps the children in your life, or in the way that you come alongside and mentor others, or in the way that you are just present in your relationships, or how you are a neighbor on your street. I wonder, who are you shaping by your life and your words and your prayers right now? Can we commit to intentionally sowing faith into someone this week? And then secondly, trust that God is at work. Even when we can't see it, he is working his purposes out. God was at work behind the scenes of Moses' life from before he was born, even amid infanticide, even amidst slavery and injustice. Can we notice God's presence even in the dark and confusing moments of our lives? And some of us might be in a situation where we can't understand the why right now. But God is weaving something bigger. Where do you and I need to trust that God is working right now? Perhaps invite him into that area of your life and ask him to help you to trust him, his timing and his purposes.
Thanks for listening. We hope you found that encouraging. Have a great week and see you soon.